Thank you for the invitation to talk to you about a subject very close to my heart indeed. This is some work which I've been involved with, which has been promoted by the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. If you're not a member of the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, I'm sorry, the doors are now locked. There are membership forms here, and until you've signed up, you won't be able to. I'm sorry about that. It's just one of those things that happens, you know. But if you would like to join the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, there are membership forms scattered around. I'm sure you would enjoy the feeling of having becoming a member if you are not. I know quite a few actually already of you are. So this is a talk about the state of Yorkshire's nature, and this is a report here on the left of the screen, which the Trust produced in June this year. It was based upon 2 years of fairly detailed analysis of what we know about nature in Yorkshire, and that is in the document to the right of the screen, which is a special issue of a journal called The Naturalist. There are two important bodies in Yorkshire. One is the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, which was founded in 1946 and was the second of all the wildlife trusts in the country to be founded. And the other is the Yorkshire Naturalist Union, which was founded a bit longer ago, about 160 years, and is still going strong, and which is a sort of umbrella body for all the naturalist societies across Yorkshire, and indeed to some extent the north of England as well. And this journal, in fact, it says on the bottom, you can't read that, but it says a journal of natural history for the north of England. So it has Yorkshire, Greater Yorkshire, I think we could call it. So anyway, so the evidence for what's in the report is all published in this other document, and it is available if you want to get hold of a copy. It's available online. So let me tell you first of all a little bit about the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, assuming this is going to respond. No. Does it work on screen?
Look at it go.
Right. Well, I'll use that if it doesn't work. That's fine. So, in case you're unaware of it, it is the only body that works across the whole of Yorkshire to protect wildlife, and that's a hugely important role. It has over 100. I think the current number is 112, but it's going up all the time. Nature reserves, though. Important though that is, they only cover 0.2% of Yorkshire, so there's a long way to go before we protect Yorkshire more thoroughly. It has these fantastic partnerships. Yorkshire Peat Partnership is an amazing thing, which has restored literally half of the peatlands of the Pennines and the Moors, which were seriously damaged. Half of them already. That's, I think I'm right in saying, 7,000 square kilometres in total have been restored. It's a huge area that has been restored. And it does a huge amount. It's very active in when there are development proposals coming in. And one of those you may remember was the campaign to save Askham Bog about 5 years ago, which was successful against most people's expectations, I think, because developers normally win these things. So it's a hugely important organisation. And it has a vision. So this is the vision for Yorkshire. It's a Yorkshire that is abundant in wildlife, which is critically important. But importantly, in addition to that, with more people having this engagement with wildlife, because unless you get people engaged, you can't protect it. And that was it's very striking. That was an important lesson from the Askham Bog campaign, because when Askham Bog was threatened, 7,000 people wrote to the council and objected. Now that's an astonishing number. I mean, you know, if you proposed to build Tesco next to the York Minster, you'd probably get 500 people writing in. You know, 7,000 is an unheard of number. In fact, it was so great that the council didn't have the capacity to do what they are legally obliged to do, which is to put up every objection on the website. It was just too large a number. We didn't object to them not doing so because they really behaved really well, the council, over that. So that's really important. We want people to be engaged. That's why membership of the trust is so valuable and so important. Anyway, let me talk about the state of nature. Now, you probably are vaguely familiar, or maybe very closely familiar, I don't know, with a national report called State of Nature, which is produced about every 4 years. The last one was produced in 2023. And on the right-hand side here, there's just a single page from it to show the sort of things it does. It looks across the whole of the UK at what's happening to nature. And it has to be said that the message is always pretty grim. Wildlife continues to decline seems to be the big message that comes across every time. And it usually gets a bit worse with every report that comes out. They've been coming out now for about 15, 20 years, something like that. So you get alarming statements like half of all plants and 1 in 8 of all insects are less widespread than they once were. And so half of all plants less widespread than they once were. The ranges are shrinking. They're just found in fewer places. Perhaps the big headline that came out in that State of Nature report last year was that one species in 16% of all species in Britain were at risk of extinction. I mean, that's a pretty alarming number. And it's different for different groups. So it's nearly half of all birds, only 11% of insects. Those are completely meaningless numbers. We just don't have the information on the insects. And in truth, if it's true at 43% of the best studied group, which is birds, it's probably true of all the others too. So it's quite likely that the real story is that something like 4 in 10 of all species are at risk of extinction. We just don't know enough about the others. So these are alarming figures. And of the bits of the landscape which are meant to be protected, so the jewels in the crown of nature conservation are meant to be the SSSIs, SSSIs, which are the sites of special scientific interest, which have statutory protection in law. Only 14% of them are in good condition. I mean, that's a startling number. I mean, virtually all of these wonderful places are in a bad way. They're deteriorating, and then the protection that is not doing its job. So the question we wanted to ask is, okay, that's the national picture, but it's all very well having a national picture. If you want to do conservation on a local scale, and Yorkshire is regional rather than local, but if you want to do it at that scale, you need to know actually what's happening in the bit where you're working. There's no point learning what's happening in Kent and Surrey and so on and so forth, however alarming that is. So we asked a series of questions. We wanted to know whether the species that we have in Yorkshire are becoming more or less abundant, and if so, which species and where. We wanted to know whether they're becoming more or less widespread. So there's two very different things. I mean, you could have something which is becoming less widespread, but it may be still very abundant where it's found, or vice versa. So you have to distinguish between the abundance of wildlife and where it's found. These are two importantly different questions. And we wanted to know, perhaps most importantly of all, which are the habitats in Yorkshire which really matter for sustaining biodiversity, and what's happening to them? Are they doing okay or not? I mean, these are fundamentally important questions. And then we wanted to use all that and ask the question, okay, we know all this now. Can we then make a prescription for how to ensure that Yorkshire becomes a place that again is rich in nature? Because it was and is much, much less so now than was once true. So that was the brief we set ourselves. And we had to ask, okay, well, what's the information that we have available? And the answer was that there were 3 or 4 groups of organisms where there was enough information to be able to really answer those sorts of questions. And unsurprisingly, the best one is birds. There are lots and lots of bird watchers out there. They love recording what they see. Birds are easy to see, generally speaking, fairly easy to identify. And so we know we actually have good information on both distribution, where they're found, and abundance, how abundant they are. There are actually systematic schemes, things like the Common Bird Census and so on, where people go regularly to the same place, do the same walk, and actually count the birds. So we actually do have real information on what is happening. Are they becoming commoner or less common, disappearing, whatever? So you could have the situation where they're still found everywhere, but only half as many as there used to be of that. So for the birds, the data are fantastic. For plants, we have fantastically good information on distribution. There are lots of botanists out there. They also love recording what they find. So we have really good information about where plants are found. We have absolutely no information on plant abundance, because if you think about it, how do you measure it? I mean, how do you measure the number of oak trees in Yorkshire? Or and try counting the number of grass plants in your lawn? I mean, these are meaningless questions. Okay, so you can't do it in that way. You have to find proxies for abundance. So we have fantastically good information on the distribution. People are now working out how we're going to get information on how abundant things are. Butterflies and moths, we have really good information on their distribution. There's lots of butterfly people out there. Increasingly, there are now, bizarrely, there are more people recording moths in Yorkshire than there are recording butterflies. So moths have become, if you want to really be in with it now, get a moth trap. That's what everybody has. During lockdown, it was impossible to obtain moth traps because everybody wanted to trap moths. And you can get them again now. They're actually, I was looking for a friend recently, and it turned out only one of the companies which used to sell still had the one he wanted in stock. They're still flying off the shelves. It's very strange. But I warn you, actually, be careful of this one. Mothing is incredibly addictive and you become obsessive very, very quickly. So, you know, go into it with your eyes open. And in particular, if you have a partner who wants to go into it, yeah, you know, be careful. So, yeah, so we have really good information for butterflies and moths, but for distribution, but we don't yet have it for abundance. There are schemes there. And for all the other groups, well, mammals, okay. The strange thing about mammals is that the people who study mammals are, I think the word is vociferous. They like splitting up into small groups. So there's a bat group and a deer group and a hedgehog group and a cetacean group. You know, so these groups often contain 3 or 4 species, or in the case of hedgehogs, 1. And so actually getting the information back out to them is quite difficult. But so we have got information on mammals. But for almost everything else, I mean, there are zillions of beetles in Yorkshire, but we know almost nothing about them. So I want to emphasize in this that this is not something I've done. This is something that a big group of people has done, people at the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, but also from the national organisations like the BSBI, which is the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, who provided all the information about the plants, from the British Trust for Ornithology, BTO, who provided and did much of the analysis for all the bird work, and from Butterfly Conservation at YNU, who provided the information on butterflies and moths. So this is not something I've done. I need to emphasize that. So let's start with some questions. How many species are there in Yorkshire? Okay, I will give you a clue. So we have roughly 2/3 of all British species. So you probably can't read on the left-hand side, but that's the name of the group down there. So at the top you have caddisflies. We have over 80% of all British caddisflies in Yorkshire. You didn't know that? That's a new piece of information. Next time you go to a pub quiz, this could be really, really useful. Actually, caddisflies are at the top of that. They've been kicked off by non-marine mollusks. We have 85% of all non-marine mollusks. The reason we are doing so well on these two groups is that the national experts for caddisflies and non-marine mollusks just happen to be in Yorkshire. So these are artifactual, probably. They're probably not so, but actually, strikingly, for most of the groups of species, we have 2/3. And the average, which is the yellow bar, is bang on 2/3. So we can reasonably confidently say that Yorkshire is home to 2/3 of all British species. Okay, so I've given you the clue. How many species do we have in Yorkshire? Give me a guess. You're all talking at once.
5 million.
How many? 5 million. Whoa, that would be impressive.
23,000. 23,000.
23,000. Interesting one. Any more? No, you're not including microbes. No microbes. Non-microbial species. I should have emphasized that. Well, okay, I'll put you out of your misery. There are 70,000 non-microbial species in Britain, so there are about 45,000 in Yorkshire. So 23,000, not bad. You get, yeah, beta plus definitely for that. Yeah, that's great. I had no. If you'd asked me a year or so ago how many species there were in Yorkshire, I had no idea. And actually, that's a pretty impressive number. So Yorkshire is still a species-rich place. There's lots of wildlife here, but the question is, what's happening to it? So it's still there, but what of that 45,000, we can start asking questions now like, how many have we lost? And the answer is, well, it's pretty variable, actually. So we've only lost 4% of our dragonflies, which is actually one species. We've lost 21%, 1 in 5 of all butterflies. Some of those have been reintroduced and are now back in Yorkshire, but nevertheless, they did go extinct from Yorkshire. So 1 in 5 but if you average that and give a weighted average, because some of these groups have lots of species, some very few, you end up with 8%. So roughly 1 in 12 of all those species have already gone extinct from Yorkshire. So that is very approximately 3,000 species. So that's a number to worry about. We've lost 3,000 species already. So that's a concern. We can also ask how many species are threatened. And for these well-known groups, there are national bodies which rate their status and whether they're declining and so how fast they're declining and so on. And they put them into 3 categories. Critically endangered means you can say goodbye to them unless you do something pretty urgent. Endangered means you better start doing something quite soon. And vulnerable means, well, if you don't do something, it'll be bad in a few years' time. The state of nature, the National State of Nature report, has 16% of British species, roughly 1 in 6, endangered. That was the figure I gave you at the beginning. 1 in 6 of all species in Britain are at risk of extinction, critically endangered or vulnerable to extinction. So what's the story in Yorkshire? Well, Yorkshire, the figure is 8%. It's very variable. It's always lower for Britain than it is for Yorkshire than it is for Great Britain. 28% versus 43% for birds, all the way down. The figures are always lower. So we're at 8% and nationally at 16%. So at first sight you think, oh, that's good. We're doing much better than the rest of the country, but that's not true, of course, because vulnerable species that are about to go extinct are by definition rare. I mean, if they were common, they wouldn't be going extinct. So they're found in a very few places. So the chances of them being found in Yorkshire are quite small. So it would be really remarkable if we had 16%, because that would mean we had a really large number of these rare species. By definition, we're going to have rather few of them. So the answer is that's exactly what you'd expect, I think. So it doesn't mean we have fewer threatened species, but it does mean that 8% of our species, something like that, are actually threatened with extinction. 8% of 45,000, you can do the maths, it's another 3,000 species. So we've got 3,000 that have gone extinct and 3,000 that are threatened with extinction. So those are not particularly good news. I'll give you some examples. So if take plants, for example, we have 108 species that are under threat in the UK somewhere. The best example of that perhaps is lady's slipper orchid. I've got a pointer, which is this one here, which is only found, well, the surviving plant. There is a single surviving plant, or possibly might be 2. The 2 shoots very close to each other. They haven't dug them up for some reason to find out whether it's 1 plant or 2. Which is in a secret location, which everybody knows in the Dales. It's actually not as endangered as it looks, because it used to be quite common. It was collected dramatically. Huge quantities were collected, particularly in the Victorian period. It's been reintroduced in lots of places with seed from those plants. And it is now actually found in quite a few places, but it's nevertheless, the single site it was down to. And then we have 115 species which are nationally rare. They're not necessarily under risk of extinction, but they are rare. And here's a nice example. So this is thistle broom rape, which is in Britain, only found in Yorkshire. It's the only place. If you want to see one, you have to come to Yorkshire. That's a Yorkshire speciality. And then we have another 83 species which are found in less than 5 places. So they are very vulnerable in Yorkshire. If they're found in 3 or 4 places, it doesn't take much for them to go extinct. That habitat is destroyed or damaged and it's gone. So this suggests that things are pretty severe. The threats are severe for the Yorkshire thing. But in every single group we've looked at, there are more species increasing their distribution than are declining. So actually, that's a good news story. There are lots of things increasing, becoming more widespread, in some cases commoner too. So colonists outnumber extinctions. Now, colonization can happen for lots and lots of reasons. climate change is an obvious one. The climate is warming and things are moving north. But there's also other things. For example, you're going to have habitat creation. So things like spoonbills, which are now breeding in Yorkshire, which I think most bird watchers 30 years ago, if they'd been told spoonbills were breeding in Yorkshire, they wonder what you've been drinking. So, you know, that's a remarkable thing. But that is at least partly due to habitat creation. They're nearly always found in newly created habitats. There are natural invasions, and there are deliberate introductions. So all these things play a part in determining whether or not something is increasing and colonising Yorkshire. And I've shown you this here, but there has to be a moth. This is a moth called the Clifton nonpareil. If you haven't seen the Clifton nonpareil, I just feel sorry for you. So it's a monstrous great thing. It's about that big. It's the biggest moth you've ever seen. It has these astonishing blue underwings. It was for years a incredibly rare thing in the south of England that it was a sort of nirvana for moth people. You know, have you seen a Clifton nonpareil? Why? How? Oh, yeah. And it's now breeding in Yorkshire. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Just in the last few years, it's just spread like mad, and this is wonderful. I mean, we're getting these remarkable changes which are very positive indeed. Sometimes those colonisation events are not natural events. We don't know what's caused Clifton nonpareil to turn up in Yorkshire, but it's probably climate change. At least part of it is climate change. Red kite, again, bird watchers 30 years ago would have given their eye teeth to see a red kite. You had to go to a single valley in Wales where a tiny population persisted. And then they were reintroduced initially in the Chiltern Hills and then at Harewood House outside Leeds, near Harrogate. As you know, they are now everywhere. I mean, you see them over York, you see them over the centre of Leeds. I mean, they've become a common bird. But that was a deliberate introduction, so there was a helping hand. But after the introduction, they have established themselves, and they've done all the work since. Sometimes those reintroductions are unofficial. The red kite was an official introduction. It was all approved and so on and so forth. But butterflies particularly, there's an awful lot of unofficial introduction goes on because it's quite easy to do. You can get eggs of the butterfly, you can breed them up and you can release them. People do this all the time. And in a sense, one thinks jolly good because they're helping butterflies which have disappeared to come back. And this is an example. This is Scotch Argus, which used to occur in the Dales, went extinct, has now been reintroduced. You can see that at Grasswood, just outside Grassington. If you go there in July, late July, you'll see this. It's doing quite well there, and it's a reintroduction. I think one can say, okay. I just wish the people who did it officially, so we know why they did it, where the butterflies came from, and things like that, rather than just doing it off their own bat. I think mostly they'd find that the people are supportive of what they're doing. It's just that they're doing it. They want to do it without anybody knowing, and sometimes they do it slightly dangerously, actually. Here's an interesting bit of information that came out of our study. So I'm talking about all these things that are appearing. Well, in the case of plants, these are very often non-native species that are becoming extremely abundant. I don't know whether you've noticed a funny ragwort that suddenly appeared all over York. It's not the famous York ragwort, which was got a lot of publicity because this is a species that was only ever found in York. It's not a species at all. It's a ludicrous hybrid. But anyway, the botanists got terribly excited about it and called it the York ragwort. And it went extinct. It appeared, was identified, and then went extinct. And it's now been reintroduced from seed that somebody had saved. That's not what the new ragwort that's all over York is not Oxford ragwort, which is the common one. It's a thing called Senecio inaequidens. It must have an English name. Apologies, I don't know it. But if you look at this map here, this is a map of Yorkshire, and the depth of colour for each of those 10 by 10 kilometre squares of land shows you what percentage of the flora is introduced by people. And you can see that if you're in the urban areas around Leeds or Sheffield or York or Teesside or Scarborough or Hull, you get a very high proportion of the flora is introduced. And once you start introducing species into your gardens or whatever else, some of those will escape. Very roughly, for every plant that is brought in to the country and grown in gardens or whatever, 10% of those will manage to survive in the wild. roughly 10% will form self-sustaining populations, and roughly 10% of those will become pests. So 0.1% of the ones you introduce will become pests. And we can think of those, you know, there's rhododendron in woods, there's giant hogweed, there's Japanese knotweed. All these are things that were brought in deliberately and have gone and become pests. In these areas, the flora is expanding quite dramatically, with new species coming in and some of those establishing themselves as part of the flora. If anybody can tell me why the Howardian Hills are a particular hotspot of introduced species, I'd be really interested. Weird result, and I have no idea why that is. Maybe the Howard family have been up to something strange, I don't know. Anyway, that's a very strange thing. So we've got species disappearing, we've got species arriving. So nature is really in flux. And around a fifth of all species in Yorkshire are declining by at least 25%. So these are not minor changes. These are big changes in the distribution of plants and animals in Yorkshire. However, at least as many species are increasing. And you might say, okay, well, number of species is not changing. Why are you worrying? I mean, okay, you'll lose some, you'll gain some. Nature will be equally rich after this has all happened as it was before. But we found something in this study which says it's actually not like that at all. And that is this. I'll need to explain this in some detail, but this is a really striking and actually really alarming result. So here, this is true of plants, but it's true also of the birds and the moths. It's just easier to show it with the plants. So we categorized all the plants, all the 900 and something plants in Yorkshire, native plant species, and we didn't look at the introduced ones, into those that were showing a big increase over the last 20 years. They were at least 50% more widespread now than they had been 20 years ago. Those that were showing an increase, which was at least 25%, those that were declining by at least 25%, those that were undergoing severe decline by at least 50%, and those that were extinct. And in the middle, we've got little change, is the species that were somewhere between an increase of 25% and a decrease of 25%. So some of these were actually changing quite a bit, but we put them in the middle. And along here, we have their national distribution in the Great Britain. And a tetrad is a 2 by 2 kilometre square, and that's how botanists record the distribution of plants. They measure which 2 by 2 kilometre square of the national grid the plant is growing in. And there are something like 40-odd thousand tetrads in Britain. And this is the average abundance of the distribution in Britain of each of these groups of plants. So if we look at the plants that are showing an increase here, there's a special reason for the large increase. Ignore that for the time being. I'll tell you about it in a moment. Look at this one here. The plants that are increasing by at least 25% in Yorkshire are really common in Britain. They're found in roughly half the places they could be found in Britain. They're common things. The increasing things are common. The extinct things are incredibly rare. The severely declining things are incredibly rare. Even the quite strongly declining things are rare. And the more they are declining, the rarer they are nationally. So what this means is we are losing rare things and gaining common things. And if you continue that ahead, what you end up with is a landscape covered with docks and nettles and pigeons and crows and cabbage whites. And that's it. You're going to lose the interesting bits of wildlife, and you simply end up with the common stuff. It's a homogenization of the landscape, so everywhere is the same. And that's a really, really worrying outcome. If you say, but hang on, what about these large increases? Well, if you think about it, if something is already reasonably common, it can't undergo a large increase. It's found everywhere already. So the large increase ones, by definition, have to be quite rare. Otherwise, they couldn't show a large increase. If they're already common, they can't show a large increase. So that's why that's an artifact there. And it emphasizes how startling this result is. I mean, the result is far more powerful than I would have expected. So what we have is a situation where we know quite a bit about what's happening to Yorkshire's wildlife, what's increasing, what's declining, and worryingly, which species are increasing and which are declining. But what we found also was that Yorkshire is a stronghold for many species. Yorkshire is about 7% of the area of Britain and about 12% of England. So we defined this thing called Yorkshire stronghold species, where any species where it has more than 14%, i.e. twice 7, or more than 24% of the English distribution, i.e. twice 12, it's much commoner in Yorkshire than we'd expect it to be. There's more of it here than you'd expect if it was just randomly scattered around. So we call these Yorkshire stronghold species, and we found we have about 7% of the plants, birds, and moths where we could do this analysis properly. So it's about another 3,000 species. The number 3,000 keeps cropping up, which are Yorkshire stronghold species. These are things which we have a real responsibility for here. And here are some good examples. I mean, tree sparrow, we have 35% of the British and 45% of the English distribution of tree sparrow. Half the tree sparrows in England are in Yorkshire. So that's a really important point. And this, of course, thistle broomrape I've already mentioned. We have 100%. It's the only place in Britain it's found is in Yorkshire. So there are things which are effectively endemic. So 3,000 species, perhaps 2,500 species of plants, which are plants and animals, which are Yorkshire stronghold species. And then we went one further than that, and we used all this information that we've got, whether they're stronghold species, whether they're declining, how rare they are, all this information, and we created an index of conservation concern. So we have this index of Yorkshire species of concern, and we can use this to actually objectively decide which species we have to worry about. So if you're devising conservation plans, that actually gives you a really powerful tool to know what to do. And we use these 4 criteria: how rare they were in Yorkshire, how threatened they were nationally, the extent of decline, and whether they had Yorkshire stronghold status. And across the groups I've been talking about, the plant with the highest index on this was, unsurprisingly, lady's slipper orchid. The bird was willow tit, which is nationally in a really bad way, and actually now in Yorkshire is in a bad way. And the moth is the dark bordered beauty, which only occurs in England on Strensall Common and is doing really badly. So I mean, there are many other species, of course, that are listed in this, but we therefore can use this information to decide what we should be doing in terms of conservation of Yorkshire's wildlife. And we think this is a useful baseline for measuring success, because if we're going to say we're going to do all these things and make Yorkshire nature rich, how are we going to know whether that's true? I mean, it's all very well going around planting lots of woodland, but is that woodland actually doing anything for wildlife? These are really difficult questions to answer. We now think we have the information which enables us to say in 10 years' time, perhaps, yes, look, it's worked, or no, not working. We need to do something different. So I think that's really important. Now, that's the species, but we also have to worry about the habitats. So which habitats should we be worrying about? Well, now, Yorkshire has some really rare and unusual habitats. So we have over half of limestone pavement, of British limestone pavement. So if you go up in the Dales and you see those amazing areas where the limestone is exposed, very rich flora and fauna in these areas. Unique habitat, and we have more than half of Britain's limestone pavement. We have more than half of Britain's upland limestone grassland. Again, it's those wonderful expanses, mainly in the Dales, but not entirely, of limestone grassland. Again, unique species. So there are obvious habitats, but we wanted to ask a more fundamental question, which is, if we have done all this analysis on the species, what do those species tell us about which habitats really matter in Yorkshire? So this is what we found. We found that for plants, the habitats, if we take those Yorkshire species of concern and ask which habitats have they really found in, we find for plants, it's grasslands, fens and base-rich mires, and particularly on limestone. For birds, it's wetlands, coasts and uplands. For moths, it's wet woodland, fens, heaths and moors. And for mammals, it's particularly habitat mosaics, but woodland again. So we can actually say, look, if you want to conserve that group, this is what matters. And you should be able to do this for other groups if we could get more impressive data on it. So one message that comes out of that straightforwardly is that if you look at that, you clearly need a wide range of habitats. You need grasslands and wetlands and uplands and woodlands and heaths, and you have to conserve everything. You can't just say all that matters is this. Lots of woodland, solve the problem. If you do that, you're favouring some things, but certainly not others. So the first message that comes out is that all habitats matter. That's really, really important. But actually, if you look at this list, something else comes out. If you look at this list here, something else jumps out at you, and you'll see that wet habitats, mires, wetlands, wet woodland, fens, river corridors, wet habitats are really, really important for all groups. So wet habitats stand out as something we have to be really, really worried about. And there's a good reason for that, which is that we have really, really trashed our wet habitats, in fact, destroyed them largely. So this is a map of Yorkshire's rivers. So you can see this is Yorkshire. There's not much in the way of rivers in the Wolds, hence the blank bit there, but this is the outline of Yorkshire going down to Spurn Point down here, up to Whitby and across to the Dales. And it just shows the main rivers on the map. And the first thing is that only 16% of them are in good biological condition. Again, so this 1 in 6 number keeps coming up. Most of our rivers are in a terrible state. The best catchment is the Esk, which is up in the moors, this one flowing down to Whitby, but even that has sections which are not very good. The worst catchment, astonishingly, is Suno, which stands for Swale, Ure, Nid, Ouse. Now, you would have thought that these rivers coming out of the Dales would be in wonderful condition. They're not. They're in really, really bad condition. So we haven't done a terrible job with our rivers. And the reason for that is twofold. So one of them we all know about is pollution. And everybody is very familiar with the problem of sewage releases into rivers. So 43% of the problem, we believe, is caused by pollution. And of that, about 29% can be attributed to wastewater, but don't forget the agricultural problem as well. There's an increasing tendency for agriculture, intensive agriculture, to cause major pollution problems in rivers. But the other thing is equally important, and the one that gets forgotten, and that's what this map actually shows, is the physical modifications of rivers. If you live in a town and don't very often go out, or if you live in the lowlands and don't very often go into the hills, you've never seen a river. We don't have rivers in the lowlands. We have drainage ditches. They've all been dredged and straightened and cut and deepened with the desire to move water downstream as fast as possible, which if you live downstream is not a good idea, because all that happens is you get the flood quicker and bigger, because the faster the water moves, the worse is the flood. And our treatment of our river system has been catastrophic. The map shows, I don't know whether you can see, it's green and red is not a good choice. I'm sorry for anybody who can't see the difference. But anything in red, and most of these rivers here are red, anything in red is an artificial or heavily modified river. The only natural rivers are the green ones, and they tend to be, well, oopsie, ooh, help. I pressed the wrong button. It says power off. Press power again. It goes away to the queue. Whoa, that was nothing. They tend to be either up in the hills or very short headwater stretches down here before it gets canalized again. It's that a river doesn't look like what we're used to. A true river has a relationship with its catchment. It spreads into it. There is wet vegetation, wet woodland and so on alongside it. None of the rivers we have in the lowlands are rivers, they're drainage ditches. And that has had a catastrophic effect on wildlife. We have lost over 80% of our wetlands. They've all gone, they've been drained. This map here, the brown, the green is the current wetlands, and they're mainly up in the hills here and a little bit down in the levels here and a little bit along a few river valleys like the Derwent. The orangey colour, the orangey brown colour is the historic wetlands of Yorkshire. We've lost over 80% of them. They've been drained for agriculture. Now, in many cases, that is essential. We need that the food production that comes from those. But an extraordinarily high proportion of that drained land is grade 5 agricultural land. In other words, it contributes almost nothing to food security. Most of the food production comes from grades 1, 2, and 3. Grade 4 and particularly grade 5 is very low grade land, producing very little. There was a study done by Henry Dimbleby, National Food Strategy, about 10 years ago, commissioned by a previous government and promptly shelved. And they showed that if you stop using the whole of the grade 5 area of agricultural land, you'd reduce food production in Britain by, I think it was 3%. It was a trivial effect. So I died again. Sorry. Go away. If you were to bring some of these areas that have been drained back into production, into a proper relationship with the rivers that they are associated with, you would have a hugely beneficial effect on wildlife, but you'd have a rather trivial effect on food production. So wet environments are really important, but so are limestone environments. And one of the strange things about Yorkshire is we have a unique geology. If you've been into the museum gardens and admired the mosaic of the first geological map, you'll know that Yorkshire has a special place in the history of geology, but it's also a unique geology. So we have 4 major categories of limestone, and they all produce different natural histories. So we have the Cretaceous, the green stuff over here. That's the bedrock, and most of this is overlain by sediment, but this is the wolds here. This is the most northerly chalk in the country, and we have the most northerly chalk streams in the country as a result. The River Hull, in its upper reaches, is a wonderful chalk stream and is being restored in places by the Wildlife Trust. Then we have the Jurassic limestone, all along the south fringe of the North York Moors here, and in the Howardian Hills, which is a totally different geology and produces a quite different natural history. We have the Permian, the magnesian limestone running right up through the centre of the county, places like Aberford and so on around there. And there are some wonderful sites down here, Brockerdale and so on. Again, quite different natural history again with that. And then finally, we've got the Carboniferous limestone up in the Dales, which is where all that upland limestone grass is. So we have this remarkable diversity of limestones. And more than half of Yorkshire's plant species of concern are found on limestone. So if we conserve the limestone areas and bring more of them back into nature-friendly management, we will do more wonders for our plant communities. So that's the story. We have lost a lot. We're gaining quite a bit. What we're gaining doesn't really match what we're losing, unfortunately. We do have to worry about the situation, but we do know what to do. It's the recipe is there. We can see what has to be done if we want Yorkshire to become nature-rich again. We have it written down quite clearly. And these are the 5 things I think we can say if we ask what needs to be done. So the first thing is to work at scale. What we've been doing over the last 100 years is conserving little patches of high quality habitat. And that's been essential. If we hadn't done that, we'd have lost far more. Those places like Askenbog, are immensely rich. They are the arcs from which nature can recolonize other bits of the countryside if we can change the way we manage it. Not just the countryside, the urban landscape too. So we must work at scale, and the Trust is leading on that. So it has a magnificent project called Wild Ingleborough, but it's also involved in something called Three Dales Project, where they're bringing together landowners across huge areas and getting them to coordinate and cooperate in the way the land is managed, with already dramatic results. So you can see things coming back. And it can be done. If you make the habitat right, nature will respond. There's no question of that. But in addition to working at scale, we have to be innovative. And people talk a lot about rewilding, which means different things to everybody just about. But we do have to be much more confident in letting nature have its way. We have had a tendency to manage like mad in the past, even when we think we're managing for wildlife. Often what happens is you manage for one particular species, but that may be terrible for other species. We have to be much more confident about letting nature have its way, but you can only do that at scale. If you're dealing with a 2-hectare patch of land, no, you can't do that. But if you've got a big area, you can let nature do its own thing. And if you do that, and this is a photograph from Knepp in Sussex, which is perhaps the best example of this approach. It's not complete rewilding. We probably aren't going to see that in much of Britain. We might see it in parts of Scotland, but it is a hands-off management approach which can produce dramatic results. We need to protect what survives, so we can't pretend that those nature reserves we have don't matter. They do, they matter hugely, as I say. They're the arcs. If we're going to get nature coming back, it's got to come from somewhere, and that's where it's surviving. So protecting what survives matters, and the fact that only 1 in 7 of our SSSIs are in good condition is a real concern. We are still losing stuff, and that's a problem. So we must protect them, and we need allies. So this guy has been a very useful ally. When we did the Askham Bog appeal, and when we did the fight against the development that was going to really seriously damage Askham, I think the developers were slightly surprised to find that we had this guy on our side. I think they were expecting a fight, but they weren't expecting him to be part of the army, as it were. So that, yeah, I was appalled actually. I mean, this man has been all over the world, and you know, when we took him to Askham Bog, he'd never been there. Can you imagine that? Anyway, he has now. We have to remember that all habitats matter. You can't just say, let's plant trees everywhere. That won't work. We have to concern ourselves with a full range of habitats because different species require different things. So that really matters. So we need to have limestone grasslands, we need woods, we need fens, and we need rivers and open water. We need all these different habitats. They all bring different things. And we also can remember that water and limestone are really, really, so if we have a choice, yes, wet places and yes, limestones, those will give you more bang for your buck than just any old piece of land. Wet places really matter. This, by the way, is the upper reaches of the River Hull, the most northerly permanent chalk stream in Britain. Sadly, it's not in the world. The Danes have some slightly further north. Very bad luck there, but anyway. But it is the most northerly in Britain. And chalk streams are just amazing. They are wonderful habitats, as you can see. I mean, this one is full of water crowfoot. It just looks gorgeous. And the final thing that we have to do is make sure we know whether it's worked. And that's where all this recording matters. And the other organisation I'm involved with, in addition, see, I thought I moved on. In addition to the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, is the Yorkshire Naturalist Union, which is the union of wildlife of naturalist societies, and we need them to be out there recording the wildlife, and we need more recorders, and we need more training of younger recorders, and we need to be very much more targeted about how we do it. So that is going to be a critically important, because otherwise we won't know whether all the work we're doing to try and make Yorkshire more nature rich has worked. So thank you indeed very much for listening. We can do it, as it says there. And by listening to me, you have actually been supporting the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. So thank you very much for that. And let me finally just give you a plug. So we're having the Yorkshire Naturalist Union, a joint conference with the Wildlife Trust on the 1st of March at the Priory Street Centre, exactly about that question. This is the state of nature in Yorkshire. We know what the current situation is, but what does it tell us that naturalists should be doing? So it's about where we go next. And there is an absolutely star-studded list of speakers there. So it's going to be a wonderful day. It's a one-day conference. You can give up a Saturday, but you come along and join in. And there are our two logos, the Wildlife Trust on the right, the Naturalist Union on the left. Thank you very much indeed.
So we're ready for some questions. So what we'll do is we'll repeat the question for the benefit of the Zoomers. So we're going to start there on.
Yes, thanks for a fabulous talk. I did John Norton Dansby a couple of times there, and he's been very active in setting up elms. Do you think elms is going to have the impact that we want and on enough scale?
I think so. The question is, will elms really have a big impact? So elms is the environmental land management scheme. which was introduced under the last government, was actually astonishingly introduced by Michael Gove. Why do I find that surprising? The answer is, if it were to happen in the way that it could happen, it will have a huge impact, because it recognises that public money should be given for public good. And in the past, that hasn't happened with agricultural support. So it's just been an acreage payment. So if you're a very big landowner, you've got a lot of money. And if you're a very small farmer, you've got very little money. And that was crazy. So the idea is that you say, what is the public good? Well, one of the public goods that farming does, obviously, is produce food, but farmers actually get paid for that. And so the argument is that at least a part of the support should go to other public goods, such as, better wildlife on your land, but critically, increased carbon in soil, so that we do actually begin to draw down carbon from the atmosphere into soils, improve water storage on land, so we get less flooding. All the goods that come, they generally are win-win-wins, these things. Will it happen? I think the answer is we have to wait and see. The government has said that it is investigating it, looking into it, hasn't decided what to do. And that is worrying and disappointing, because other than that, they said a lot of the right things about the natural world. And I don't know what is going on there at all. I don't think anybody, well, obviously some people know what's going on, but I certainly don't know what's going on there. So the answer is, I don't know, but potentially get it right, and it could have a transformative effect. 3/4 of Yorkshire is farmed. So if we want there to be more wildlife, it has to be that the farmed landscape is richer in wildlife. And that somehow, and of the remaining 25%, over 10% is urban. So, what you're not left with a huge amount, which is not one or the other. So we need both the urban and the agricultural landscapes to be more nature rich. Yeah.
Thank you very much, but are you paying enough attention to the problems of the population? I have a lot of experience, because I used to work in Imperial College, where the parakeets have complete populations in Kensington Gardens. And over quite a wide area of West London as well. They've become an absolute pest. And I come to York the last 10 years, and I find the small bird population has disappeared in the centre of York. There's far less than there is actually in West London. And shouldn't we be paying much more attention to how to recreate a small bird population in some of these urban areas, beginning with York?
So should we be paying more attention to small birds? My answer is going to be no, not that I think they're not important. I think it's really important, but I think the whole tone of what I've been trying to say is that you mustn't single out one thing and try to conserve that, because if you do that, you'll be ignoring everything else. And you can't get the bird populations back without getting the insect populations back, because most of those birds are insect feeders. And my best guess as to why so many of these bird populations are declining is because they've got nothing to eat. I mean, the insect populations in the whole of the country have been catastrophically low. This year has been appalling. I mean, the most recent information we have, current information, is from the big butterfly count. It's the worst year ever for butterflies in the whole history of the butterfly count. And if you look at the graphs they've just produced from Butterfly Conservation, they came out yesterday, I think, it shows a steady decline over the last 15 years. I mean, it's up and down, and there's been some good years, but you can quite clearly see that butterfly populations, which are a good proxy for other insect populations, are declining. So I think the answer, if you want the birds back, you've got to fix the whole natural world. They are a symptom of a general decline. We have trashed the natural world. There is no question of it. And it's not too late. The wonderful thing about the natural world is it recovers. Give it a chance and it recovers. And that's been shown time and time again. So my answer to you is, I don't think we are paying insufficient attention. They're in there. All the information on those birds is in the reports. I urge you to read them.
So what you're saying is we should be concentrating more on ecosystem.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I think the old idea of individual species conservation, though important, is really a bit out of date now. You need to conserve whole systems. Yeah.
So behind our last questioner, and then you, Sue. Okay.
Right, and do you think
Do we use pesticides excessively in this country? I don't think, compared to other countries, I don't think we do particularly. I don't have the data at my fingertips, I'm afraid, on that. But I mean, there are worrying things. I mean, the rest of Europe has banned neonicotinoids. This country has a derogation from the ban to allow sugar beet farmers to use that. There's plenty of evidence to show that you don't need to do that, and neonics are extremely damaging indeed, and they're very persistent and broad spectrum insecticides that just kill everything. And when we're in an insect population catastrophe as we are, actually making it worse deliberately is a very good idea. I think I have a huge amount of sympathy for the farmers in this situation. They've been driven by an economic system into forms of land management which many of them dislike. I've spoken to a lot of farmers who don't want to be doing that, but it's very, very hard to take the plunge and move away. I mean, I know farmers who've done that, who've changed their management completely, and what they find, it's a brave thing to do, but what they find is their inputs go down dramatically. Okay, their outputs go down too, but actually they make more money because the outputs go down less than the inputs go down. So I think we use far too much. We do need, I mean, you can't farm in a modern industrial way without using pesticides, but you can certainly find cleverer ways of doing it than we currently do.
Sue.
You mentioned that some species are increasing, but have you? The other question.
Yes. Okay. So the first question is, are there any brand new species? But which I take it you mean never before seen anywhere. And the answer is the York groundsel was claimed to be precisely that. And generally speaking, you're more likely to see that in plants than any other. They're much better at producing new species than many other groups. And they do that because they can reproduce vegetatively. So they hybridize. Normally hybrids are sterile and can't breed, but if you're a plant, you can, if you're a perennial plant and you hybridize, you can just go on growing vegetatively, as lots and lots of garden plants do. And then sooner or later, something happens and they become fertile. And the best example of that of all, if you go to Spurn or anywhere else in an estuary, you will see acres and acres of cordgrass, stretching as far as the eye can see. The cordgrass that you see is a completely new species that appeared in late 19th century in Southampton water as a result of hybridization between a native cordgrass and an introduced species of American cordgrass. And it turned into a new species which has colonized, it's all over the world now, it's colonized the world. So new species appear all the time. I don't think there's been a particular increase, but it's likely to happen because as we introduce more and more species and change the environment in which they live, we are creating selection pressures which will favor new species. So I think the answer is, hasn't happened much yet, but it will. And the second species was, what about beavers? The second question was, what about beavers? All I can say is bring them on. I don't understand why people are so worried about beavers, because there is no easier species to control than the beaver. You don't have beavers and not know about them. So if they really are causing a problem, you can move them. It's the easiest thing in the world. So, and they would, I mean, we go to huge lengths to try and control floods when we have a ready-made flood control mechanism. Just introduce beavers and they will stop the floods. This has been shown. I mean, the dramatic change in flooding. I mean, actually, there's now data from the Pickering trial that we do have beavers in Yorkshire, but they're behind a fence up in Cropton Forest. If anybody has a good pair of wire cutters, I can tell you where. I didn't say that at all. But they are wild in Scotland, and they're wild on the River Otter, surprisingly, for some reason, as opposed to the River Beaver in Devon. And there's been detailed studies of what happens there, and they can show that the flood peaks downstream are now far, far smaller than they were before beavers. So they're just, I mean, it's balmy. They're a native species. We exterminated them. You know, let's bring them back. Yeah, I don't understand the reluctance, I'm afraid. As I say, if they become a problem, and they would be a problem in some places, you just move them.
Can I ask you?
Yeah, of course.
There's different sorts of farming. At the moment, as a consumer, we're told that organic farming is really good, and now appearing is regenerative farming as a real brand sort of leader. In terms of farming itself, what is, you know, what are the differences between the two and their impact on the natural world? And is regenerative farming just a hype and another way of trying to or is it you know? So if you can tell us a bit what the differences are, what they're about, and what we should support.
How long have you got? I promise to make it brief. Okay, so organic farming is, of course, a very special case of regenerative farming. So organic farming is where there is no use of artificial pesticides, fertilizers, etc. And it's wonderful. It produces lower yields than ordinary farming. But it does so very much more in harmony with the natural world. But you wouldn't be able to feed the world on organic farming. So it has to be something you do in some cases, but not others. Regenerative farming, but it's one extreme, it's one end of the spectrum, as it were. You've got hyper-industrialized farming, you know, where you have cows which never see the light of day and are fed on soybeans grown on cleared rainforest in Brazil or something, at one end, and then you've got organic farming at the other. Regenerative farming sort of lies towards the organic farming end of the spectrum. It's a great reduction in the use of inputs. The regenerative bit is the idea that you're regenerating soil, and fundamentally what matters to a farmer, or what should matter to a farmer, is the soil, because that's what produces everything. I mean, if you don't have soil, forget it, you're not going to produce food. Which is why one of the things that baffles me about our treatment of rivers, you go and look at a river now, it's brown. But brown is soil. It's the soil washing out to sea. We're losing the soil. We're losing the soil because of the determination to get the water off the land as fast as possible. So if you get water off the land as fast as possible, it takes the soil with it. And that really upsets me when I see all that soil going down the river. So regenerative farming is largely about minimizing the ploughing and disturbance of the soil, which breaks up all the microbial networks in the soil and slows down growth of the plants. It ensures that the nutrients are cycled within the soil more effectively, so you need fewer inputs in that way. It tends to use smaller fields or smaller patches of crops, so you don't get this problem of, if you have 30 hectares of one crop, then every pest that wants to eat that crop knows exactly where to go. If you have smaller patches, then it's much more difficult for the insects that are, or fungi or whatever, to establish themselves in that way. So there's a whole series of things you can do, which mean that you're farming more in tune with nature, with the natural world. And it's a range of different things. There isn't one thing which you could call regenerative farming, but it's something to be encouraged. Yeah, it's a really good thing.
Thank you. One more question.
Other than flood mitigation and carbon capture, which you've already mentioned, are there any other benefits of preserving nature for non-nature lovers?
Okay, well, why should we preserve nature for non-nature lovers? That's a really interesting question. Another hour-long talk for you, I'm afraid. So the answer is that the natural world supports us. We are part of it. We can't live separated from it. I mean, we can try doing that in cities. And some cities, the natural world is hard to see. But then if you go to that city and you ask people, what are you drinking? And the answer is they're drinking water. Where do they get the water from? Well, they probably get the water from the water treatment works. But the water treatment is depends upon natural processes, and the cleaner the water that goes into that, the easier it is to clean it up. There's a fabulous story from New York. America still has public water utilities. We don't. We have privatized water for reasons best known to somebody. There's a wonderful story about the New York Public Water Utility. This is going back about 30 years. They needed to build a new water treatment plant because the water in the Hudson River was so foul. So they costed this, and it was going to cost N billion dollars. I forget what N was, but it was a very large number because water treatment plants are expensive. And then running the water treatment plant was going to cost N billion dollars a year. And for rather less than that, for dramatically less than that, they discovered they could buy up most of the Catskill Mountains, protect the catchment, and then get clean water, which they could pipe straight to New York. And that's a classic example of why preserving nature actually, it provides us almost everything that we value comes ultimately from the natural world. And if you don't conserve it, and conserving the wildlife, you might think is just a sort of, it's a curly cue upon this, the main thing is to preserve the forests or whatever, but you can't have forests without the full spectrum of the wild. If you just have a plantation, then you'll get pests. And if you've got pests which will destroy you end up with a single species of tree, right? Something will go straight through it, and then you've got no trees at all. I mean, if our forests were all ash, we'd be have a big problem with ash dieback, but it's not as bad as it would be as if we'd planted ash everywhere, as it were. So having a diversity of wildlife in an ecosystem makes it resilient to the shocks of life, and we need those ecosystems. We depend upon them, absolutely. Fundamentally, we depend upon soil and everything it does. I mean, I'll give you the soil talk next. Okay.
I'm going to call to close and invite Jonathan Evans to come and give our vote of thanks on our behalf. Thank you, Jonathan.
So thanks, Tim, for asking me to do the vote of thanks. As Southern townies moving to Yorkshire many years ago, Judith and I were quick to discover the countryside. And we've got a couple of books still from those days. One was the Reader's Digest Book of Birds, the 1980 edition, which was edited by your father. And we also have the Collins Guide to the Wildflowers of Britain and Northern Ireland, which I believe you co-wrote with your father. So on a personal level, a very big thank you to the Fitter family. And I'm sure we represent a tiny fraction of those to whom we've imparted enthusiasm and knowledge. Thank you also for the reminder that for all its challenges, we still live in a great county, a special county. I thought the talk was an absolute tour de force. As we know, the very best of speakers make complex subjects simple, and I think we saw that today. It's given a deeper understanding into the countryside, the geology, flagged up some hope, that balance between disaster and hope. Also pointed out there is no improvement without detailed analysis. We know what to do and it can be done. I mean, those are the two messages that I take, together with some specific things about wet habitats, Grade 5 land, and so on. Finally, I would encourage people, I'm sure most people here are probably members of Yorkshire Wildlife Trust or the RSPB, but if you're not, please sign up. Volunteer in any capacity, it's great fun. And also the thing that I don't think you mentioned was that the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and the RSPB do a lot of lobbying on our behalf. They are big lobbying organisations. So at that level alone, it's worth joining up and encouraging other people to do the same. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for a fantastic talk. It's been a great evening.